I think you've done a great job. I mean, my interaction with Christine goes back a few years. She actually expressed interest in getting involved with the Trust over IP group. She's been focusing on a innovative product that advances governance and evidence supporting, how effective governance policies are, and I'm excited to learn more about that and present her to the audience here.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. Yeah, time flies when you're having fun, and I can't believe it's been a few years since you and I first met. So thank you. The honor is mine to be here. I want to welcome everyone to my talk, The Making of an Enforceable Policy and How it Improves Auditability. My name is Christine Sanni. I am one of the co-founders. My co-founder, Ike Sanni, is on today, of Sybal Corp, and I sit CEO. I get to lead, and it is really a privilege to be able to lead an incredible team of talented engineers and analysts that are continuing to develop our solution. Our solution is focused on automating the enforceability analysis and measurement of policy, policy effectiveness to be specific. I wanted to start this talk off, though, with going over my why. Who wakes up to do governance? And I will share very candidly that my why has continued to evolve and become even more clear to me as I meet the people behind the policy, the process, the procedure. So I've had an incredible opportunity to sit with compliance officers, chief risk officers, analysts, people actually executing the process that is described in policy. And those people, all different walks of life, all different journeys that have led them into their roles of execution. And what I understand about governance today is that governance really does mitigate real risks, risks that negatively impact human life, way of life, our experiences in life. But on the other side of that, governance also creates opportunities for us to improve outcomes that can also be transformative for life. So I want you to know that that's my why. Today, as I sit before you and I go over this talk, I'm so excited to continue my commitment in computational governance, and what that can mean for transforming life in different aspects of society. So why don't we begin with the topics that I will cover today. I will tell you, I could talk about governance literally all day. I really enjoy the topic of governance. So again, let's make this as interactive as we can. I'm happy to take questions throughout the presentation. But today I will provide an overview of what makes policy language enforceable, language, rules, sentences within policy enforceable, how to write enforceable language, the sort of the components, the feature, the characteristics of an enforceable rule, and then how enforceability actually improves auditability. So with all the things that I will cover today, I'll go through some examples. These are really the key things that I'd like for you to look for in this presentation. I think they will be the most valuable to you, especially as this committee is focused on governance and standards and policies. These topics here will be incredibly insightful for you. So I will start with what is an enforceable policy. So some of you may be familiar with the term enforceability, but I will be very, very specific in that we define an enforceable policy as consisting of language, again, rules that are observable and measurable. Now, what I also want to say is that it does not indicate the language's effectiveness or how well the policy itself is implemented. Enforceability is specific to, can I observe the execution of this policy? And based on that observation, do I have enough information to measure how effective it is? So, with that said, I want to dive into observability. What makes a rule of policy observable? Let's start with looking at an enforceable rule. Again, enforceability is observability and measurability. So in this particular example, I have an enforceable rule. That rule is the sales representative must provide a copy of the return policy with the receipt to the customer at the time of sale. When I look at this sentence, I see three features popping out. I've color coordinated them to make it easy for us to all see it together. But when you look at what does it mean to be observable, you're looking for these three characteristics. The first characteristic is there a responsible party? So who is responsible for making the outcome of this rule or sentence or policy happen? In this example, it is the sales representative. The second feature you see is what we call outcomes. What must happen as a result of the execution of this particular sentence, broader policy? And so we see in this example that the outcome is that a copy of the return policy has been provided with the receipt to the customer. That is the outcome. That's how we know this rule was executed. And then the how, we call this the condition. It could be when this outcome must happen, where it must happen, how it must happen. And so in this example, you have at the time of sale. And what we find about observability is when you have now and have written your rule, your policy with observable language, observable features, two things actually happen. The first thing that happens is that when you look at those features, you actually begin to understand what information you need to collect in order to observe that language. One of the key areas when working with clients around writing policy that is aligned with higher governance, that is regulation, guidance, statutes. It's what information do I need to collect? And where do I get that information from? And so what is so exciting about writing policy rules, writing your language with this observability is that it immediately tells you what data, what information is needed. So in this example, your enforceable rule, the sales representative must provide a copy of the return policy with the receipt to the customer at the time of sale. When we look at the responsible party, it's clear for us that, well, we need who the person is, the sales rep is, who that responsible party is. That piece of information would become really critical to observing the execution of this sentence. On the outcome side, providing a copy of the return policy with the receipt. Of course, you would need information like the receipt ID, maybe the notice ID to see if those two things were executed and delivered in the manner they were supposed to be delivered at the, which is the last component here, the condition, time of sale. So you would need things like time of sale, sale ID, date of sale. And so that observability immediately helps you understand what information do I need to actually observe this sentence. But there is an additional benefit. That additional benefit is now that I'm looking at the right information and I can observe that information, ultimately what I'm observing is the performance of that rule.
Mhm.
And when you can observe the performance, like, did we do something or did we not do something, you can actually measure. So this is the other component of enforceability. Again, remember, enforceability is not how well your policy is implemented or even how effective it is. I'll say it in another way, in that um, enforceability does not equate to effectiveness. It is not a guarantee. And so this observation is saying you need to continue to observe so that you can measure how well that policy, that rule, that sentence is performing in operation. So it's really exciting to see now,
Mhm.
fundamentally, that enforceability gives you now new capabilities to be able to have a proactive governance framework. So I want to take us into an example, and I'd like for you to meet a process owner responsible for authoring policy that governs the submission of spending reports. Let's say that's her role. She owns that process. So this is my first question over to the audience. This is her rule within this policy. The budget analyst will submit the spending report to their department supervisor as required.
Mhm.
I'm going to turn it over to the audience really quick. Is this rule actually enforceable?
I think the condition is vague, as required.
Who is that?
That's
I can't see who's talking.
sorry, that's Eric, and then Neil has that same comment in the chat.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So you guys are really good at this, right? So I was going to ask, what's missing here, right? So we do have a responsible party. We know that it is the budget analyst who's responsible for executing this task. We have the outcome. The spending report will be submitted to the department supervisor. But as you stated, the condition is vague, it's ambiguous at best. And ambiguity in policy creates room for misinterpretation, right? And it does put enforceability at risk. When one or more of that criteria is missing, the rule then loses enforceability. Sure, you may have, okay, who's supposed to execute it, and you may have the outcome. But if the condition is missing and vague, I may read this sentence and say, oh, well, I have time on Friday. I'll submit it every Friday. Or someone else may read it and say, well, as required, I'll get to it when I get to it. And then, of course, in a compliance world, in an audited world, that lack of standardization then leads to failed compliance events, audit opinion, right?
Mhm.
And so you start to see how the language itself, the enforceability of the language, is the foundation needed for
Mhm.
um, being able to have a stronger auditability posture. So, examples of ambiguous language you pointed out: as required, immediate, like, ooh, too vague, if applicable, sufficient when appropriate, as needed, when required, all the different flavors. These words create subjectivity, misinterpretation, lack of standardization. And so let's look at how to write an enforceable policy. First, it's using very definitive language, right? Use definite language to remove that subjectivity and mitigate misinterpretation. I use the word mitigate because there is always the human element, right?
Mhm.
So even if you have an enforceable policy, there is still the need to have that observation and to, based on that observation, truly measure the overall effectiveness of that sentence, because there are all of the uncontrollables that create an environment where you go from being reactive learning that the policy or the language doesn't work at the time of audit, to being proactive when those uncontrollable variables happen and still you have this policy. So using words like must and shall and required to, those not as required, but you are required to do this at this time, are really, really important, right? So the question becomes, if you have a requirement, when is the action required? You want to write that in your sentence. That is the condition. When is it applicable? What is actually sufficient? So taking it just one step further to define that, what is appropriate, right? And when is it needed? Defining these criteria, what it does is it sets the parameter of performance. I don't want to move too quickly from that, because when you set the parameter of performance, you are setting the expectation. And then what happens in the real world, the what we call expression of that performance, you can now compare back to. So examples of this would be like must submit before 5 p.m. versus submit as needed or as required, right? A consent form is required when the patient is less than 18 years of age, right? Or instead of when needed, every Monday. So these small shifts in language, using that definitive language, is really, really, really important. And it just immediately changes the structure and the enforceability of your policy. So then when you look at policy, you're not just looking at a document, you're looking at sentence by sentence. Do I have these features of enforceability within each sentence? And then if I do, I understand now what information I need to collect in order to observe and then therefore measure. So this is really the making of an enforceable policy. We have a responsible party, we have outcomes, we have conditions, and we also have data. So if we were to go back to our process owner's example, we could improve that by taking that ambiguous language and giving it more definition, more criteria. So it could look something like this, right? The budget analyst will submit the spending report to their department supervisor every Friday. It removes room for misinterpretation. It sets a clear parameter. And then if, say, the spending report is submitted on the following Tuesday, it's clear to see that this rule was not executed as expected. And because we have that enforceability structure in the sentence, we now understand what information we should collect to maintain that visibility and measurability. So I want to talk about that just for a moment. What value does that create when you have and are collecting the right data? Our work thus far here at Sybal, we've been able to directly connect this introduction of enforceability, or the presence and the lack thereof of enforceability, to audit opinion, audit results. And so I think as an initial benefit, right, to having this enforceability be the structure of your policies and standards and controls, immediately when you're collecting that right data, you have accessibility and you have availability. And that means when you collect the right data, that data is easily accessible to the stakeholder that needs it and readily available when needed for your audit. This is your evidentiary matter, right? So when an auditor and examiner comes in and they are reviewing a sample size of data, you have the right data that you need, the evidentiary matter that you need, specific not just to the policy document, but at the sentence level, which is really, really exciting. That reduces the time, it reduces the cost and the labor that clients will expend to ready themselves for audit. The other value add is that when you are observing and collecting the right data, you can be proactive, right? Rather than reactive, and find out at that compliance event that the policy as written um, is not enforceable, not clear, not concise, right? And therefore impacting performance. So when you collect the right data, you can act before audit events and really shift your governance posture from reactive to proactive. And all of that to say that collecting the right data enables you to be audit ready at any given point, right? When you use that data to enhance your policies and correct performance gaps, you sustain that level of auditability. And so, to summarize all of this, enforceability becomes the foundational building block for auditability. And when you have that strong foundation, you improve your readiness, you improve your ability to sustain that posture over time. So here are my really key takeaways from this discussion. We've went over enforceability. Enforceable policy is observable and measurable, not an indicator of how well it is implemented in operation, not an indicator of how effective it is. It is just simply the beginning that I have the ability to observe and measure this language. Rules that include outcomes, conditions, responsible party allow for that observability. And ultimately, observability helps you define and collect the right data for measurement. And last but not least, enforceability is the building block for auditability, improving your readiness capabilities and sustainability. So I'm going to pause. Those are my slides. I will say just a little disclaimer. This is, of course, not legal advice. This is for educational purposes only, but definitely something to think about when you look at language, when you look and search and see these ambiguous descriptors in the sentence structure, removing those and adding very definitive, clear, concise parameters, criteria, has so many impact, so many value adds on your experience to be auditable and ready. And ultimately, there is a path to go into an audit with confidence when you take this perspective. I'll pause.
Excellent. I'll just pipe in real quickly. Thank you for that. I mean, it's so good to see it laid out so clearly. And I think a lot of us on this call, or at least in this working group, are looking at this through the lens of AI agents.
Yeah.
And because from our, we've got the governance, we got the trust side of things, and there's this burst of AI agents on the scene, and the agents are going to be taking all of these decisions on our behalf. And the challenge now is to implement policy that these agents can follow so they don't just get out of control, right? And it's really helpful to see how the policy can be structured for the agent decision making. And
Yes.
because there's everything that you talk about, well, what who's giving the agent instructions, and what kind of decisions are they making? And we need auditability, because if the agent goes rogue and buys the 10 times what I asked for, we need we need audit logs so that we can dissect and figure out who's responsible. And so it's really helpful to see this through that lens. And I guess one of the questions I have is where, how applicable, or, where do you see from sort of human process that's observable from an auditor every 6 months or every year, as opposed to something that's real time auditable in the digital world where the evidence collecting is just bits and bytes? Do you see any sort of difference there?
Yeah, so it takes me back to our patent process, actually, where you, in theory, have two areas of business operation. It's the human element and then the system element.
Mhm,
And so um, this form of computational governance, system to system governance, right, is taking the human process and digitally capturing it.
mhm,
So when you think about clients today that are integrating technology, whether it be AI agents, agentic AI, or generative AI, or another system, improving an internal system, it's actually much easier, right?
mhm,
Because the data is being generated, right? And it's being executed, and it is simply, I go back to the presentation, a matter of collecting the right data,
mhm.
right? And so what I'm saying is when you think about governing an AI system, it starts with the language. It
Right.
starts with the policy, right?
Yeah.
And then you are calling the right information from the execution, from the metadata, to
Mhm.
tell that story, to help you see in real time, and
Right.
to have that traceability and auditability. So
Mhm,
it's much easier to do that from a system to system perspective. And I've got an incredible team online here.
mhm,
I'm not saying that it is, for an organization who may not be technical to set up this system to system governance, right?
mhm,
But what I am saying is, if you are in a organization where a lot of your processes are manual and they're executed by human,
mhm.
much more complicated, right? To get them to the point where they can have this capability
Yeah.
because they have to go through the modernization. They have to start collecting and capturing the right data.
Right.
Um, so I think it is, though complex, I will say we are up all day and try to go to bed as early as we can to wake up the next day and do it again,
Mhm,
to have this capability and to continue to think outside of the box as to what systems are we going to have to connect this
mhm,
type of computational governance system to. But the
mhm.
information is there,
Yeah.
but you need the right information,
Well,
and
and
that's the key.
yeah, and it's interesting as well, because once you've understood the right information to surface, there's the other part in terms of the agentic AI is observability. It's like I want to
Yeah.
know what decisions are being taken now, so that I can understand if the policy is being followed, if what the intention of the agent's action is that, is the information they're collecting used for that intention? And we need the transparency, the explainability, and that comes via observability. So it's
Yes, yeah.
that.
And I think the other benefit of this is that when you have system to system governance and you are observing
Mhm,
all of those behaviors and execution and information, and surely it's telling you a story. What it's also telling you is how effective or how impactful the original language is,
mhm,
right? So the other piece of this, I think, is acknowledging a truth about governance in that there is no perfect policy. And
mhm,
in fact, we're saying the systems that this policy is governing, the procedures that this policy is governing, is very dynamic. Surely, in a world of agentic AI, it would be extremely dynamic because it is learning at the same time of executing. Um, and so this information becomes even more valuable to the one that is continuing to enhance and optimize and elevate the quality of outcomes for a specific purpose. I think there should always be a reason why one does anything. So if you are using these agentic AIs to execute and create a better experience for your customers per se, it's important to take that observable information and actually correct, right? Be proactive, enhance your policy. The challenge has been to date that policy is very static in nature, which is completely incongruent with the nature of what it's governing, which is very dynamic and ever moving. And you have, to your point, people and systems and regulation and all of these things that are happening. And so what I understand about policy is written with the assumption of effectiveness. It's written best effort, which is incredibly hard to do. But this is a practical way to set yourself up for success, which is to write enforceable language, observable, measurable language that will help feed back information to you.
I have more questions, but I don't. I want to know if there's any other people that are going to jump in as well. If not, I will ask my other question. All right, I'll go. So is there, following on from that, the who, what, how, or where,
Yes.
in the case that the policy is not executed or whatever, is there a sort of similar equation that says, if you don't send in your spending reports by Friday, is there another sort of corollary that is also clear for the sort of the mitigation part of that?
Yeah, so a part of that outcome, I listed maybe one outcome, but I think this is your opportunity. So now that you have that structure, I can see that you're going beyond like, ooh, well, there could be another KPI in here, right? Like we could have this policy in place to actually achieve X or prevent X, right? And so you could take it one step further on the detection side. If the detection is, hey, this rule is simply not being executed, and I'm also seeing the presence of something that I'm looking to mitigate, we've got to go back to the sentence, right? The parameters actually are not as effective. So the detection tells a really powerful story. But now that you see that you have this sort of sentence structure and equation, now this is an opportunity for us as policy authors, writers, process owners to actually build the intended and expected outcome into the sentence. So what's really interesting about ecosystems are typically tied to, say, if you had a decentralized autonomous organization, and with that DAO, there were expected outcomes of all the members, right? Like we want this much percentage of interaction or this percentage of growth. Those are actually features, outcomes that you can look for in the data, right? And so you can expand your policy or expand your process to include that expected outcome as well. So now you have no limitation on how many outcomes you can set within a policy. And that gives you the opportunity and the mechanism to start looking for the presence of or the lack thereof. And that gives you more insight, right? I think we were talking earlier in the conversation about rule as code or, governance as code. What I'm saying is, yes, you can code and develop, how this particular technology or organization should execute, this ecosystem should execute, but it still goes back to the language. This gives all of us an opportunity to say, why are we doing something? What is the intended impact? And now you can build that into your policy, which gets really, really exciting, right? So if you think about this traverses any governance domain. It traverses really any document. what if I have a strategic plan for my ecosystem or a business plan for my business? This methodology becomes really, really impactful. It's not just words on paper. I'm writing this in hopes it works out. Is if you use this structure, you actually will have observability and measurability on the outcome.
Thank you, Scott. I see your camera's on.
Yeah, so just a couple of comments as I'm listening to this, with my background as an auditor. So there's a couple of things we focused around auditability and enforceability, but it goes to a higher level. So governance requires accountability of those that are to be governed to demonstrate that they are in compliance with requirements. And so this is empowering. It's not an auditability enforcing, but it allows participants to demonstrate, and have the wherewithal to come up with the constructs to demonstrate that I'm meeting the requirement. Okay, so the onus should be on the auditee as opposed to the auditor. And that's one of the comments. The other is to address your agentic AI focus. And I think, Christine was dancing around, the types of controls. There are a variety of different flavors of controls, which are another kind of x-axis around it, another dimension, which is preventative controls are better. Detective controls are okay, because detective controls, you're allowing errors to take place, but the series of detective controls that you have in place could mitigate the amount of non-conformant items. And so is that accepted? That's only as good as your detective process. And then finally, corrective controls, you're allowing a host, but you're not creating enough risk to, a higher level of risk, a catastrophic risk. And so as and to address your question around the rogue agent, if we can move towards, especially with rogue agents, have more preventative controls to not allow agents to do anything that we're not asking. That's the key thing. We need to have more preventive controls, especially as we're looking at machine operation, because the level of detection we'll have is not going to meet the speed of transactions. We're going to allow too many errors to happen.
Mm-hmm. Those
Excellent.
agents are tricky. We've got Neil and then Jim who have hands up.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me is, and again, looking at AI agents as semi-autonomous, is auditing. And auditing of their actions is going to require what has been true forever in the aviation industry is extensive logging. What exactly happened in the last 2 hours? I mean, all the disaster recovery of something going wrong on aircraft and pilots and everything else has been heavily dependent on everything is, you may throw stuff out after a while, so the data doesn't get too big, but it's meticulous, verifiable information collection. But to Scott's point, tell me all the actions you did based on my request. Wait a minute. I see from the log that you did a whole bunch of things that circumvented the policy. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, logging is key, Neil. It's a really great point. And what you'll find when you have ambiguous language and descriptors in policy, you are missing the criteria. You're missing a lot of that data where you could prove that you've done something or not done something, right? And so it does go back to making sure that you've got the right information being collected, logged, and kept for that audit ready posture. Jim, see your hand.
Yeah, two things. A couple of things. So at Fidelity, we had a slightly different model than Scott proposed. So we did do the concept of prevention for production issues. We did certainly do detection, and that relied on a lot of different things, including logging and everything else. But then we had two other things that happened. So when we detected a problem, there was a set of, I'll call it actions that were possible for that problem, in our case, usually automated, that said you can react to this event this way. And it might have been three different choices based on some other criteria. But that wasn't the end of it. We then wound up creating an incident of the event that got reported, which is fine. Bigger thing was there was another step called remediation. So there's really four steps. It's prevention, detection, act, and then remediate or respond, act or respond, I'll say, and then finally remediate. So there was four really for us. The other thing that, and you guys have been mentioning it, all of you, I think, when you talk about agents, we've had agents forever. There's nothing new about agents, automated agents, actually. The only difference now is we're saying, oh, wait a minute, these agents can make decisions different than the agents we've had before. So we've had agents for 30 years that were automated and could take actions that were programmed on logic. Difference here is we're saying, wait a minute, newer agents now with Gen AI would have the, and LLMs, whatever type, would have the ability to do their own inference, not only do their own inference, reach their own conclusions, but also propose different actions. So they're not pre-programmed things that somebody signed off on 2 years ago and said, hey, these are the three steps you can take. It is more creative. So the two things we were doing with the old model of agents was we did restrict them on two ends. So one end was an agent could only act if all the conditions to allow him to act were met. And so there are many times where an agent couldn't act. So you had something go wrong. There was a set of conditions. You have an agent responsible, and the agent can't act because the conditions aren't all met. So what happens? Then that response, in a sense, as Christine, as you said earlier, does get routed to quote human people that go have to say, what in the heck just happened and what am I going to do about it? Because the agent wasn't authorized for responding to, I'll call it that kind of a problem. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing is that when the agent does propose an action, and this is where I think your solution comes in, you say, okay, Jim wrote this really cool, smart agent, figured out, and it thinks that the action we should take now is this. It's nice to have an external governance service in a sense that can review, if nothing else, at least review the action and say that's consistent or that's, whatever, not recommended or something, or even prevent the action. Do you know what I mean? So the idea of external governance operating on top of my production services makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
And I think you're right, Jim, as well, in these agents are what are they? They're not deterministic. They are probabilistic. And so whatever they're doing within the freedom they have, at some point you need to route them back through that equation and say, go off and do all of your inference, be creative, do what you have to do with your new LLM brain. But when you come back and you're about to make a decision, it has to go through this policy. And I think the other thing that Christine was saying that really resonated with me is it doesn't mean that your policy is effective, because I think especially in these in our world, the minute you lay out a policy, you'll have hackers trying to do an end around the policy and just tell us where the guidelines are so that we can work within those guidelines and be undetected. So comply to the policy and yet still get our nefarious actions done. So I thought that was really important to say that you might have a good policy that
Yes.
has criteria, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's effective. And so you need to keep out.
That's a pretty sobering truth, right? It's like, ooh, right. But I think it's good to have that fundamental truth, because to Scott's point, the onus never leaves the human.
Mhm.
It never leaves the organization, right? And so, oh, we did X, Y, and Z, and it's like, I like to have these conversations. It always goes back to, what did the policy say at the time of the non-compliance event? It's like, okay, well, show me your policy for this, right? So it is a very sobering truth, but it gives those in the compliance world an opportunity to continue to innovate and have that change management and improve. And so there's so much value that I think has gone sort of highlighted within organizations, right? Compliance and risk mitigation and governance has always been seen as like an inhibitor to innovation. But I believe when you have this observability and measurability is actually very insightful. Now, turning that on to system, something like agentic AI, you are now shedding light on what could be a very black box, right? Like, ooh, the execution. And how did that relate to what I expected it to do? And is it actually giving me the outcome that I'm looking for? That is very, very insightful, right? This is the ability to have a real-time feedback loop informing you so that you can continue to innovate and enhance. So I think part of the onus in the governance and compliance and risk world is being able to shed light on the value that this creates for innovation, for human experience, for moving society forward. The technology is not going to go back in the box. It's already here. And we should expect that it will continue to expedite in its ability to execute and process, especially when you start putting in quantum computing, quantum sensing, quantum networking. All of these things will continue to advance and move us even faster into where we are going. But this is an opportunity for us to, as humans that own the responsibility of using these technologies to create an experience, having that insight makes us smarter, which is something that's really exciting.
We've got 4 more minutes, and I've got one more question unless somebody else does. And so I guess, so my question is, are you seeing, so, what's your perspective on getting policy into workflow? So making it easier for the policy to be observed, because I think a lot of the feeling we have about policies is you get the policy and you put it in your filing cabinet, right? But now to get that policy into workflows, into day-to-day processes where the policy is, observable, there's flags there, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, so at Sybal, we have a rules engine, right? And so, yes, you have to take the policy even off of SharePoint or wherever it's housed, off of your saved drive, out of your desk, out of your book, and you have to put this inside of the digital ecosystem and connect them together. And so that is a capability that is a requirement to have this posture and visibility and measurement. So yes, I envision a world where auditability is automated across every domain where that ingestion has happened.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work to do, right? A lot of regulated markets, a lot of ecosystems that haven't been developed yet. So looking forward to being a part of this journey. But yes, that is the path, is to ingest it, digitize it, put it into this executable, enforceable, observable, measurable format, and let it tell a real story.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
We've hit the top of the hour, so I guess maybe we will, unless anybody has last comments, we'll say thank you to Christine and Sybal.
Thank you.
And the team.
Thank you, team. Thank you, Scott, for the invitation. Surely appreciate it. And I've got, and on another note, I have to reach out to Scott to talk about how we get involved and support the work that you guys are doing. So Scott, please hold me to that.
Absolutely. We'll get you an invitation to join Trust Over IP. There you go.
And don't forget the November 19th, 20 symposium, virtual symposium. So we'll make sure you get those details and hope to see you there.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, team. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.